Greg Norman stood on the 18th green, staring down the winning putt at the Open Championship. Twice in his career, he buried it, claiming golf's oldest major like it was just another Sunday round. A moment like that should define a career, but Norman's legacy is a mix of heartbreak and controversy that still gets debated to this day. Known as the Great White Shark, Norman was one of the most dominant golfers of his era. He spent 331 weeks as world number one. I mean, that's nearly 6.5 years sitting on top of the golf world, looking down at everyone else like a shark circling its prey. Yet, for all that dominance, his major championship count stands at just 2. For a guy who played like a champion week in and week out, that number feels almost absurd. Norman had everything, brilliance and precision, but golf has a cruel side, and it showed up at the worst possible moments for him. The 1986 Masters, the 1987 Masters, the 1996 Masters, his career is littered with final round meltdowns that are still talked about today. He was losing in ways that made people cringe. At his peak, in the 1980s and 90s, Norman was respected. He won 91 professional tournaments across the world, including 2 Open Championships in 1986 and 1993. But his aggressive playing style and outspoken personality didn't exactly make him the most popular guy in the locker room. Some saw him as someone who could push golf into a more modern era. But some thought he was arrogant, too concerned with his brand, his businesses, and his legacy outside of the game. His influence on the sport, his battles with golf's governing bodies, and his role in controversial moves like LIV Golf keep him in the conversation long after his playing days ended. Norman remains one of golf's most fascinating figures. He swung like he had a personal vendetta against the golf ball, and for a long time it worked. He went from a young Aussie kid chasing kangaroos, probably, to one of the most dominant forces in golf. But golf isn't just about looking cool and smashing 300-yard drives, unfortunately. It's about winning, especially the big ones. And that's where things get complicated. During his peak of the career, the 80s and 90s were stacked with killers. You had Nick Faldo, the human metronome who played golf like a chess match, boring but ridiculously effective. Seve Ballesteros, who could get up and down from the parking lot. Fred Couples, who made the game look effortless, like he was just out for a casual Sunday stroll. And of course, Tom Watson, the guy who thrived under pressure and racked up majors like it was no big deal. Now, when it comes to major championships, Norman's numbers don't scream legendary. He won 2, the Open in 1986 and 1993. Solid, but when you stack that up against his competition, it's, let's just say, underwhelming. Take Nick Faldo, for example. While Norman was out-muscling golf courses with aggressive, go-for-broke shots, Faldo was playing the long game, methodical, calculated, and annoyingly consistent. And it worked for him. He walked away with 6 major titles, including 3 Masters and 3 Open Championships. Then there was Seve Ballesteros, the Spanish magician. The guy was all about creativity. You could drop his ball in a bush, a bunker, or the middle of the Atlantic, and somehow, he'd find a way to save par. He won 5 majors, 2 Masters and 3 Open Championships. But while Faldo and Seve were busy hoisting trophies, Norman was often stuck watching from the side. He put himself in the mix a lot. He had 30 top 10 finishes, meaning he was constantly knocking on the door, but somehow, the door usually slammed in his face. If golf handed out trophies for consistency, Norman would have a shelf full of them. The guy was always at the top of leaderboards, week after week, tournament after tournament. He was more dominant than most of his rivals in terms of rankings and consistency. But when it came to those clutch, career-defining moments, he had some brutal misses, some historic collapses, and a few times where fate just straight up decided, nah, not today, mate. If there's one thing Greg Norman knew how to do, besides crushing drives and making absurd amounts of money, it was losing in the most heartbreaking way possible. And nothing sums that up better than the 1996 Masters collapse. Going into Sunday, Norman had a 6-shot lead. That's a victory lap waiting to happen. All he had to do was keep the golf ball somewhere in the same zip code as the fairway, make some solid pars, and grab his green jacket. But, well, golf had other plans. Instead of cruising to victory, Norman's game fell apart in slow motion. Hooks, blocks, misreads, you name it, it happened. Meanwhile, Nick Faldo, the human metronome, just kept playing steady, mistake-free golf. And with every hole, Norman's lead shrank faster than a cheap t-shirt in the wash. By the time they reached the 18th, Faldo won by 5 shots. Watching Norman that day felt like watching a train wreck, except the train was on fire and actively accelerating toward disaster. And that wasn't even the only gut punch of his career. Norman was the king of so close, yet so far. He had 8 runner-up finishes in majors, which, if we're being honest, is just a fancy way of saying he was the best at not quite winning. If it wasn't a late collapse, it was a freak accident. A bad bounce. A guy like Bob Tway holing out from a bunker to steal the 1986 PGA Championship. Seriously, it's like golf had a personal vendetta against him. Greg Norman has never been the type to just fade into the background. If it was not through his game, it was by just pissing people off. This guy, like his business ventures, like his event list, has a long history of butting heads with the PGA Tour. Norman has had beef with the tour for decades, and honestly, it's kind of impressive how long he's kept it going. Back in the 90s, he tried to start a breakaway World Golf Tour, which the PGA promptly shut down faster than a bad Tinder date. Fast forward to now, and Norman is basically the face of the enemy as the CEO of LIV Golf, the Saudi-backed league throwing absurd amounts of money at golfers to ditch the PGA. And boy, has that caused some drama. Players like Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy have gone out of their way to call out Norman and LIV Golf, basically saying he's ruining the game. Tiger even turned down $700 to $800 million. Yes, you heard that right, to join LIV because he wanted no part of it. And Norman didn't take that well. The man has been in a verbal slap fight with Tiger and PGA loyalists ever since, and he's not exactly known for taking the high road. Then there's his comments on the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. When the world was calling out Saudi Arabia, Norman's response was, let's say, not ideal. He brushed it off, saying, we all make mistakes. Yeah, Greg. Forgetting an anniversary is a mistake. Murdering a journalist? That's a little different. Between his PGA feuds, LIV Golf drama, and some truly terrible PR moments, Norman has managed to turn himself into one of the most divisive figures in golf. Some see him as a revolutionary, shaking up a stale system. Others see him as a guy who sold out and just won't stop talking about it. Everyone has a different opinion of him. And let's just say, depending on who you ask, you'll get very different answers. Tiger and Norman's relationship has always been rocky, to put it nicely. Back in the day, Norman tried to give Tiger some unsolicited advice on handling pressure. Tiger basically said, thanks, but no thanks. And that pretty much sums up their dynamic. Tiger never really respected Norman's take on winning because, well, Tiger actually knew how to close out majors. Fast forward to the whole LIV Golf drama, and their relationship went from meh to full-on beef. Tiger has been one of LIV's biggest critics, calling out players for chasing money over legacy, and he's made it very clear that he's not a fan of Norman leading the charge. At this point, if you locked these two in a room, you'd probably need a referee. Jack Nicklaus, however, has always acknowledged Norman's talent, because, let's be real, the guy could play. But Jack also knew Norman had a bad habit of losing when it mattered most. He once said Norman had all the tools but just couldn't finish the job when the pressure was at its peak. He saw Norman as someone who should have won way more than he did. Phil Mickelson and some of the LIV guys respect Norman, but let's not kid ourselves, it's more about what he's doing now than what he did back then. Norman isn't really talked about as a golf legend in the same way as Nicklaus, Palmer, or Tiger. Instead, his name is more tied to LIV Golf and the chaos surrounding it. Either way, Greg Norman is never boring. Greg Norman was a good player or the bad, I'm still figuring that out, but he was a great businessman. Most golfers retire and maybe pick up a side gig as a TV analyst or a casual course designer. Norman, on the other hand, went full corporate mogul. Golf courses, real estate, wine, clothing, you name it, he put his shark logo on it. The guy basically made more money off the course than he ever did on it. The guy has generated a net worth of $400 million, that's way too much from what elite players have. They can take it up to $150 million, but he has turned a name in every industry. His golf course designs were everywhere. He made sure his wine was high-end. And you must have seen the 50-year-old dad strutting around in a colorful polo with a little shark on it. That was his doing as well. The man's even got real estate like he's collecting monopoly properties. His former Florida estate, Tranquility, was a 32,000 square foot megamansion with its own dock, tennis courts, and a ridiculous amount of luxury that he later sold for around $40 million. And when he's not in the US, he's got a stunning Australian ranch, complete with cattle and wide open landscapes, because apparently he needs entire ecosystems. Then there's his garage. Or should I say showroom? Ferraris, Aston Martins, Bentleys, Norman has driven them all. But the real flex? His Gulfstream V private jet. Forget TSA lines, Norman flies like a CEO on vacation. And if that wasn't enough, he's also got a thing for high-end watches, flashing Rolexes and Richard Mille timepieces worth more than most people's mortgages. Golf may have made him famous, but business and luxury turned him into a brand. So while most of his peers were just trying to make the cut, Norman was out here making millions off branding alone. He was the golf businessman. So after everything we've talked about, his dominance, his collapses, his rivals, his business empire, where does Greg Norman really stand? Well, as a golfer, he was one of the best of his era. No question. The talent, the power, the ball striking, it was all there. But when it came to the biggest moments, the guy either ran into bad luck or just couldn't close the deal. But step off the course, and it's a different story. If golf had a CEO, it would have been him. The great white shark turned himself into a brand, slapped his name on everything, and built a business empire that made his playing career look small in comparison. So was he an all-time great? As a golfer, he was up there but left a lot on the table. As a businessman, he was unstoppable. And as a public figure? Well, let's just say he's got just as many critics as he does fans. Greg Norman made sure no one would forget him. Do you think Norman deserves more respect, or did his off-course moves ruin his reputation? Let us know what you think in the comments below.